It's October. The air is getting colder. The leaves are changing. And it's the time of the year the ghouls wander the earth. In honor of this most chilling of seasons, let's take a look at the history of one of the spookier publishers in comics history, EC Comics. The EC Comics story begins with the founding of a different publisher, All American Comics. Founded in 1938 by Maxwell Gaines, who had just a few years earlier helped to practically invent the comic book format with the creation of the newspaper comic reprint series Famous Funnies. All American published the debuts of such classic characters as the Green Lantern, Hawkman, the Flash, and Wonder Woman. So, what happened to All American? Well, in order to establish the company in the first place, Gaines had received a substantial investment from Harry Donenfeld, seen here riding an elephant. Donenfeld was CEO of National Allied, the company that would eventually become DC. In 1944, Donenfeld absorbed All American into National Allied, after Gaines had sold off his share in the publisher to his business partner Jack Leibowitz. When selling off his shares, Gaines managed to retain the rights to one book published under All American, which he took with him to his new publishing house. Sensing an end to the superhero craze of the early 40s, Gaines formed Educational Comics, with a primary focus on publishing comics about topics like history and science. The company would continue to publish these stories for a couple of years before the untimely death of Maxwell Gaines in 1947. After Gaines's death, the company was left to his son William Gaines. Under the leadership of the younger Gaines, the company was renamed to Entertaining Comics and shifted away from the educational focus of their previous content and focused more on topics such as crime, romance, science fiction, and perhaps most famously, horror. The shift began with crime-based comics such as Crime Patrol, which began publication in 1948. As part of this shift, Gaines began hiring creators such as Al Feldstein, who would eventually be a long-tenured editor for the company. The biggest push for this new direction for the publisher, commonly known as the New Trend, came in the spring of 1950, when a Western anthology known as Gunfighter was revamped as The Haunt of Fear, starting with issue 18. The crime anthology War Against Crime became The Vault of Horror at issue 12, and the previously mentioned Crime Patrol was revamped as The Crypt of Terror, later renamed as Tales from the Crypt, beginning with issue 20. The EC horror era began with the mutual love of the horror genre between staff editor Al Feldstein and company head William Gaines. The comics became famous for their shocking, sometimes ironic stories, and their iconic artwork by artists including Jack Davis, Wally Wood, Joe Orlando, and Jack Kamen. Unlike many publishing houses at the time, EC did not have a standard art style forced upon their artists, often encouraging them to create their own distinct styles, and EC was one of the few publishers at the time that allowed artists to sign their artwork. With the success of the horror titles, EC began to branch out into general science fiction stories in 1954, with the introduction of Weird Science and Weird Fantasy. At the company's peak of popularity, their books were selling up to 400,000 copies a month. So what happened to them if they were so successful? This man happened. In 1954, at possibly the peak of EC's popularity, German-born psychiatrist Frederick Wertham published the book Seduction of the Innocent, which suggested a correlation between comic books and juvenile delinquency. While Wertham wasn't the sole cause, He was a sparking point for the then rising moral panic over graphic content in comic books. It got so far as to having official hearings in Congress. William Gaines himself testified during one such hearing representing EC Comics. As a result of these events, the comics industry collectively self-imposed censorship guidelines in the form of the Comics Code Authority. Let's just say these guidelines were a bit harsh on horror titles specifically. A few choice selections from the initial 1954 criteria. Scenes of excessive violence shall be prohibited. Scenes of brutal torture, excessive and unnecessary knife and gunplay, physical agony, gory and gruesome crime shall be eliminated. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. No comic magazine shall use the words horror or terror in its title. Any lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. Any scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism shall not be permitted. Following the implementation of the Comics Code, EC continued to operate within the comics industry. They canceled most of their previous books and replaced them with a new line of books. Instead of the previous crime and horror anthologies, this new line included things like period-based war comics, a new science fiction anthology, adventure comics, medical dramas, and, oddly enough, a series about psychoanalysis. None of these comics lasted terribly long, all of them only lasted about 5 issues. And just because they were playing by the Comics Code's rules now, that didn't mean they were done dealing with controversy. In 1954, after the Comics Code had rejected a story intended to be published in Incredible Science Fiction, issue 33, EC Comics decided to replace the story with one that had been previously published in Weird Science Fantasy prior to the implementation of the code. The Comics Code promptly rejected that story, objecting to the fact that the story contained a black protagonist. Gaines refused to back down from this, and brought the issue before the Supreme Court. In the end, the Comics Code agreed to approve the story, and it was printed in the final issue of Incredible Science Fiction. However, this incident proved to be a catalyst for Gaines to exit the comic book market. To replace the latest line of canceled comics, artist Jack Kamen suggested transitioning to a line of highly illustrated prose magazines that he had dubbed Pictofictions. EC published 4 of these magazines: Shock Illustrated, Crime Illustrated, Confessions Illustrated, and Terror Illustrated. All 4 would be canceled after about 2 issues when the company's distributor declared bankruptcy. Despite this, EC Comics still had 1 card left in their hand. In 1952, 2 years before the implementation of the Comics Code, EC began publishing a humor comic, edited by EC staffer Harvey Kurtzman. The series was known as Mad, and was comprised mainly of pop culture parodies. While initially Mad was seen as a side project by the company, by the end of the Pictofiction era, it was the company's top seller. With that in mind, in 1955, Gaines decided to fold the entire company under the Mad umbrella. The company canceled all of its previous products in order to focus entirely on Mad. Unfortunately, monetary and creative conflicts between Gaines and Mad editor Kurtzman led to Kurtzman leaving the company in 1956 alongside a majority of his creative staff. Kurtzman was replaced by longtime EC editor Al Feldstein, along with a brand new staff. In 1962, Gaines sold Mad to National Periodicals, a company partially born from his father's previous company. After the sale, Gaines remained on the board, allowing him to retain control of the magazine. Kurtzman went on to various other projects, such as Help, another satirical magazine, which helped launch the careers of people including underground cartoonist Robert Crumb and future Monty Python member Terry Gilliam. Kurtzman would later contribute cartoons for Playboy, and would do so for many years. After the end of EC's time in the comics industry, their books have been reprinted multiple times over the decades by a number of different companies. The most recent reprints being the EC Archives series from Dark Horse and Russ Cochran, who had worked on multiple EC reprints throughout the years. Over the past few decades, a few of EC's titles have seen life outside of the comic book medium. In 1972, British filmmaker Freddie Francis adapted 5 EC horror stories for his anthology film Tales from the Crypt, though only 2 stories would come from the series of the same name. A year later, the film was followed by a sequel named after Vault of Horror. Ironically, a majority of the second film's stories came from Tales from the Crypt, with no actual influence coming from Vault. In 1989, Tales from the Crypt would be adapted again, this time as a television anthology series for HBO. The series ran for 7 seasons before ending in 1996. Since the HBO series ended, there have been a couple attempts to reboot the series. One was in 2011, only it would be serialized as opposed to being an anthology, and it wouldn't feature the Crypt Keeper or any other host. So in other words, it just wouldn't be Tales from the Crypt. More recently, there was a proposed reboot from filmmaker M. Night Shyamalan, although that series has since been shelved due to rights issues. And while not an official adaptation, the CREEPSHOW series of films were heavily inspired by EC's various horror books, even going as far as to use art by former EC artist Jack Kamen. EC adaptations haven't just been limited to the strictly horror stuff, however. The 1985 John Hughes comedy Weird Science was adapted and updated from a story published in issue 5 of the comic of the same name. In addition, after the success of the Tales from the Crypt TV series, HBO produced a spin-off called Perversions of Science, inspired by stories from Weird Science. Even before all those adaptations, however, in 1955, the Comics Code era comic Psychoanalysis was adapted for The Tonight Show with Steve Allen. I haven't been able to find much on this, but apparently this happened. And so, EC Comics went from a company that primarily published educational children's comics to one of the most vilified companies in the comic book industry, and an icon of horror and sci-fi.